I stood behind the bar in a building I now owned, polishing a glass I didn't need to polish, watching the woman who helped destroy my career walk into the room like she still ran it. She didn't. And in about 40 minutes, she was going to find that out in front of every person in this room who had ever underestimated me, which, if I'm being honest, was almost all of them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the thing about stories like this one: the ending only lands if you understand exactly how quiet the beginning was. And if you're the kind of person who stays for that kind of story, the kind where the power doesn't announce itself but simply arrives, then stay. Because this is one of those. My name is Mara Ellison. For 11 years, I was the invisible architect of Holloway Group, a luxury hospitality company that, on its surface, looked like it ran itself. It didn't. I made it look that way. That was my job. That was, for a very long time, my entire life. And the moment I stopped being useful to the people at the top, they made sure I understood exactly how little all of that had meant to them. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand where I started. I was 19 when I walked into the Ashford Pavilion for the first time. It was a Wednesday. The place was mid-renovation, drop ceiling still exposed, wiring hanging like veins from a body that hadn't been finished yet. I wasn't there to admire it. I was there because I needed work, and the only position open was busgirl. Not waitress. Not a hostess. Busgirl. The kind of job where you move through a room like furniture, present, necessary, invisible. I took it without hesitation. The manager at the time was a man named Carl Dean. Stocky, perpetually irritated, the kind of person who communicated mostly through sighs and disapproving glances. He looked me up and down when I walked in, said nothing encouraging, handed me a black apron, and pointed toward the kitchen. "You clear tables," he said. "You don't linger. You don't make conversation with guests. You move." I moved. For 2 years, I moved through that building like water through cracks, fast, silent, unnoticed. I learned things in that role that no business school would ever teach. I learned how rooms work. How people behave when they think no one important is watching. I learned the rhythm of an event, the way tension builds before a keynote, the way alcohol loosens the room, the way the staff dynamics in the back of house determine everything the front of house will feel like. I learned, most importantly, that invisibility is not weakness. It is information. By the time I was 21, I had quietly reorganized the entire back of house workflow for Wednesday events. Carl didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't acknowledge it. The events ran smoother. Fewer mistakes. Less waste. Nobody asked why. That was fine. I wasn't doing it for credit. I was doing it because the work mattered to me, and doing it well was the only thing that had ever felt like mine. It was Grant Holloway who first saw me. Not in the romantic sense. Grant was 45, married, and about as romantically present as a man who treated every social interaction like a networking opportunity. He saw me the way a CEO sees an asset before it has a title. We were at an event, one of the larger ones, a charity gala for a local children's foundation, and a vendor had just collapsed. Catastrophically. The floral arrangements hadn't arrived, the AV system was malfunctioning, and one of the senior servers had just walked out after an argument with the kitchen manager. Carl was frozen. Not panicking, exactly, more like a computer that had stopped processing. He stood near the entrance with his arms folded, watching the chaos with the particular expression of a man who had already decided it wasn't his fault. I was in the back, clearing a prep table, when I realized no one was fixing it. So I did. I didn't announce it. I didn't ask permission. I called in a contact I'd built a relationship with at a rival florist, someone I'd helped out 6 months earlier with a last-minute order, and got a replacement arrangement within the hour. I rerouted the AV signal through a backup system I'd quietly mapped out weeks before, just because I liked knowing how things worked. And I found the kitchen manager, sat him down for exactly 4 minutes, and said something I won't repeat here, but the server came back. The event ran smoothly. Beautifully, even. Grant watched all of it from across the room. Not the chaos, the calm. He watched me move through the crisis like I'd rehearsed it, and afterward, when the guests were gone and the venue was emptying, he found me in the kitchen, still cleaning up. "You're Mara," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "Carl doesn't know what he has." I didn't say anything to that. I just kept wiping down the counter. Grant smiled, a small, genuine smile, the kind I would later learn he reserved for people he found genuinely useful, and said, "I have a position opening up. Operations coordinator. It's not glamorous. But it's real work." "I'm not afraid of real work," I said. "No," he said, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I didn't think you were." That was the beginning. Over the next several years, I climbed quietly, steadily, without ever pushing for it, into one of the most critical roles in the company. Not the most visible. Never the most visible. But the most load-bearing. I became the person Grant called when something needed to be handled without anyone else knowing it needed handling at all. A client threatening to pull a contract over a service issue? I handled it. Quietly. A staff member whose behavior was becoming a liability? Addressed firmly, discreetly, and with enough care that the person left without becoming a problem. A partnership that was quietly falling apart behind the scenes? I saw the signs months before anyone else and bought us time to restructure. Grant relied on me the way a surgeon relies on the hand that holds the instruments. He never said it that way, he wasn't the type for metaphors, but the dependence was there. Unspoken. Absolute. And I, for my part, believed in it. Genuinely believed that this kind of loyalty, this kind of steady, invisible contribution would be recognized. Maybe not publicly. Maybe not with a title change or a raise or a standing ovation. But in some fundamental way, I believed that the people I had spent years protecting would, if the moment ever came, protect me back. I was wrong about that. But that realization didn't come all at once. It came in small, easy-to-dismiss pieces over the course of about 8 months. And the first piece arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when Grant walked into my office, a modest, windowless room on the second floor of the company's main property, and said something that, at the time, sounded completely harmless. "I want you to meet someone," he said. "My daughter. Lila. She's joining the team." I looked up from the spreadsheet I was reviewing. "Joining how?" Grant shifted his weight, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but one I'd learned to notice over the years. It was the movement he made when he was about to say something he hadn't fully thought through. "She's going to lead a new initiative," he said. "Modernization. Fresh energy. We've been a little static, Mara. You know that." I did know that. I also knew that static was not the same as broken, and that the stability I had spent years building was, in fact, the reason the company could afford to experiment at all. But I didn't say that. Not yet. Because at that point, I still trusted Grant's judgment. And I still believed genuinely that my role was secure enough to absorb whatever this new initiative was going to be. "Sure," I said. "I'd like to meet her." Grant nodded, looking almost relieved. "Great. She'll be in tomorrow." He left. And I went back to my spreadsheet. That was the last normal conversation we had. Lila Holloway arrived the next morning like a weather system, not loud, exactly, but impossible to ignore. She was 26, polished in the way that people who have never had to earn their polish tend to be, and she carried herself with a confidence that, on closer inspection, had very little to do with experience and everything to do with expectation. She expected to be listened to. She expected to be deferred to. And in this company, where her father's name was on every door, that expectation was, at least initially, honored. She found me in the break room during my first interaction with her. I was pouring coffee. She walked in, smiled the kind of smile that is designed to disarm, and extend her hand. "Mara. I've heard so much about you." "Have you?" I said, taking her hand. Her grip was firm. Practiced. My dad talks about you constantly, she said. He says you're the reason this company works. There was something in the way she said it, something just barely off, like a note played a half step too high that I noticed but didn't examine. Not then. I thanked her, finished my coffee, and went back to work. I told myself it meant nothing. For about 3 weeks, it didn't. And then it did. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong came not from a conversation, but from a calendar. I had been with the Holloway Group long enough to know the rhythm of the company the way a musician knows the tempo of a piece they've played 100 times. I knew which meetings happened on which days, who attended, what was discussed, and more importantly what was decided in the rooms afterward, in the conversations that never made it into any official record. I knew all of it. Because for years, I had been in those rooms. So when I noticed, on a Thursday morning in early April, that a strategic planning session had been scheduled, a session that, by every established protocol, I should have been part of and my name was not on the invite, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Something closer to the feeling you get when you walk into a room and realize the conversation that was happening just stopped. I didn't say anything about it that day. I told myself there was an explanation. An oversight. A scheduling conflict I wasn't aware of. Grant was busy. These things happen. But then it happened again. The following week. And the week after that. Each time, the meeting involved decisions that directly touched my area of responsibility. Each time, I found out afterward not through a call from Grant, not through a quiet aside from someone on the team, but through an email. A formal, corporate email, written in the passive voice, announcing that the team has decided to move forward with whatever had been discussed. It was the language that bothered me most. Not we decided. Not Grant and Lila decided. The team. As though the decision had emerged from a collective, faceless process, as though no one had actually made a call. As though accountability had simply been designed out of the room. I read those emails carefully. Each one. And I started to see a pattern. The decisions weren't random. They weren't chaotic. They were deliberate and they were all moving in the same direction. Away from the systems I had built. Away from the processes that had kept the company stable for over a decade. Toward something newer, flashier, and significantly less tested. Toward Lila's vision. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for what comes next. I did not dislike Lila Holloway. That's not what this is about. I have never been the kind of person who resents someone simply for being young, or ambitious, or connected. Those things are not crimes. What concerned me started to genuinely alarm me, in the quiet way that only someone who has spent years watching a company breathe can be alarmed, was not who she was. It was what was happening around her. Because the people in that room weren't just listening to her ideas. They were dismantling mine. The first time I raised a concern directly, it was about staffing. Lila had proposed through one of those faceless emails, naturally a restructuring of the event floor teams. The core staff, the experienced servers and coordinators who had been with the company for years, were to be replaced. Not all at once. Gradually. Quietly. Under the language of optimizing for efficiency and refreshing the talent pipeline. I requested a meeting with Grant. He agreed, though it took 3 days to get one scheduled, something that had never happened before. When I finally sat across from him in his office, I laid it out clearly. The experienced staff knew the clients. They knew the rhythm of the events. They knew, in ways that no onboarding document could capture, how to read a room and respond before a problem became visible. Replacing them wasn't modernization. It was dismantling institutional knowledge. Grant listened. He nodded. He said, "Mara, I hear you. I really do. And your concerns are noted. Not addressed. Not discussed. not weighed against the alternative. Noted. I left his office that day feeling something I hadn't felt since my first week as a busgirl, the specific, uncomfortable sensation of being in a room where the decisions have already been made, and your presence is simply a formality. I told myself I was overreacting. I was not overreacting. The second incident happened 2 weeks later, and it was harder to dismiss. There was a client, one of our most significant, a woman named Catherine Voss, who ran a private foundation and had been holding her annual gala at Holloway Properties for 6 consecutive years. Catherine was not easy. She was precise, demanding, and had a memory for details that made most people uncomfortable. But she was loyal, and her loyalty, once earned, was absolute. I had earned it personally, over years of careful attention and consistent delivery. Her event was coming up in 5 weeks. The kind of event that, under normal circumstances, I would have been coordinating from the ground up. Instead, I received another email informing me that the coordination had been reassigned to a new team member. Someone I had never met. Someone who had been with the company for less than a month. I called Grant directly. This time, he picked up. Grant, the Voss event. It's being handled, Mara. By someone who doesn't know Catherine. Who doesn't know her preferences, her standards, her. Lila thinks it's a good opportunity for the new team to step up. There it was. Not a decision made by the company. A decision made by Lila, filtered through Grant, delivered to me as though it were already settled. And if it goes wrong? I asked. My voice was calm. I made sure of that. There was a pause on the other end. A long one. It won't, Grant said. And then, quieter, trust the process. I hung up. And I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the wall, thinking about what trust the process actually meant when the process had been redesigned by someone who had never run one. The third incident was the one that should have broken something in me. The one that, in a different kind of story, would have been the moment the protagonist stands up and fights back. But that's not how the story goes. Because I didn't fight back. Not then. Not the way you might expect. What happened was this: there was a team lunch. Informal. The kind of thing that happens naturally in a company where people have worked together for years. Someone suggests it, a few people join, and it becomes an unplanned hour of conversation that, more often than not, reveals more about the internal dynamics of a company than any formal meeting ever could. I was there. So was Lila. So were about 8 other people, coordinators, junior managers, a couple of senior staff members I'd worked closely with for years. At some point, the conversation turned to a recent event, one that had gone slightly sideways due to a miscommunication about dietary restrictions. It wasn't a disaster. It was a small error, the kind that happens in any operation. But it had been noticed by the client, and it had been flagged internally. Lila mentioned it casually. Almost offhandedly. And then she said something that was clearly meant to be a joke, the kind of comment that lands differently depending on who it's directed at, and that can always be walked back with a laugh if someone objects. Well, she said, smiling in that practiced way of hers, at least we know the old system wasn't perfect either. The table laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to fill the silence that followed. I didn't react. I didn't smile, and I didn't frown. I simply picked up my water glass, took a sip, and let the moment pass. But I noticed something at that moment. Something important. I noticed who laughed, and who didn't. I noticed who looked at me afterward, with something like an apology in their eyes, and who looked away. I noticed the exact shape of the room, who was aligned with whom, and where the fault lines ran. I filed it away. And I kept eating my lunch. That evening, I went home to my apartment, a clean, modest place on the 4th floor of a building near the waterfront, and I sat on my couch in the dark for about an hour. Not thinking, exactly. Processing. The way a system processes data before it decides what to do with it. I thought about the meetings I'd been excluded from. The emails are written in a passive voice. The staffing changes. The Voss event. Lunch. Each one, individually, was dismissible. A pattern of small slights that could, if you wanted to, be explained away as growing pains, miscommunication, the natural friction of change. But I had spent 11 years learning how organizations actually work. And I knew with the same quiet certainty I'd felt when I reorganized that back-of-house workflow at 19 that this was not friction. This was a campaign. Not a conscious one, necessarily. Not something Lila had mapped out on a whiteboard with arrows and timelines. But a campaign nonetheless, a slow, methodical process of making someone irrelevant before you make them unnecessary. And I was someone. I thought about confronting Grant. About sitting him down and laying it out plainly, not with emotion, but with evidence. The pattern. The decisions. The direction. I thought about what I would say, and how I would say it, and what his face would look like when I did. And then I thought about the way he'd said trust the process, and I realized something. He already knew. He wasn't confused about what was happening to me. He wasn't blind to it. He had simply decided quietly, without fanfare, in the way that leaders make decisions they don't want to examine too closely, that I was expendable. That realization didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a door closing. Softly. Completely. With a click that echoed in a way I knew I would hear for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, in the dark, and I let the feeling settle into me like sediment into water. And when it was done settling, I felt something I hadn't expected. Calm. The termination, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. That's the thing no one tells you about being let go from a place you've given years of your life to. They make it sound like it's going to be dramatic, a confrontation, a raised voice, a moment where everything comes to a head. But it isn't. Not when it's done the way Holloway Group did it. It's quiet. It's procedural. It's a meeting scheduled with no context, a room with too many chairs, and a piece of paper slid across a table by someone from HR whose name you barely know. The meeting was on a Monday. Early. 8:15 in the morning, which told me everything I needed to know before I even sat down. People don't schedule difficult conversations early in the day unless they want them over with before the rest of the building wakes up. The HR representative, a woman named Sandra, whom I had hired 3 years prior, was already seated when I walked in. She had a folder in front of her. A single sheet of paper was visible at the top. I recognized the company letterhead. Grant was not in the room. I sat down. Sandra opened her mouth, and I watched her prepare to deliver a speech. She had clearly rehearsed something about restructuring, about the evolving needs of the organization, about how this decision was not a reflection of my performance or my contributions. I stopped her before she got through the first sentence. Sandra, I said. You don't have to do this part. I understand what's happening. Just show me the paper. She blinked. Looked down at her folder. Then looked back at me with an expression I can only describe as relief, the kind that comes when someone else makes a difficult moment easier for you without being asked. She slid the paper across the table. I read it carefully. Not quickly, carefully. Every word. Every clause. The language was exactly what I had expected, neutral, corporate, deliberately devoid of anything that could be interpreted as cause. Restructuring. Organizational realignment. Position elimination. The kind of words that sound serious but mean nothing, because their entire purpose is to make sure that the person reading them can't point to a single sentence and say, there. That's where they went wrong. But it was the other sections that I focused on. The severance terms. The non-disclosure agreement. And, most importantly, the non-compete clause. I read that clause 3 times. It was broad. Unusually so. It restricted me from working in any capacity, not just with Holloway Group's direct competitors, but with any company operating in the luxury hospitality or event space within a geographic radius that effectively covered the entire region. The duration was 18 months. 18 months. In an industry where relationships are everything, where your network is your livelihood, where being absent for more than a few weeks can feel like disappearing entirely, 18 months was designed to do one thing. It was designed to make sure I couldn't come back. I set the paper down, folded my hands on the table in front of me, and looked at Sandra. "Who wrote this clause?" I asked. Sandra hesitated. It was a small hesitation, the kind that lasts less than a second, but I caught it. "I always catch those." "Legal drafted it," she said. "Standard language." It was not a standard language. I knew enough about employment contracts to know that. But I didn't push it. Not then. Not in that room. "Okay," I said. And I signed it. Sandra looked surprised by that. I could see it in the way her shoulders dropped, a tiny release of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. "Thank you, Mara," she said. And she meant it, in the way that someone means it when they've been spared from having to do something unpleasant. I stood up, took my copy of the paper, and walked out of the room without looking back. I did not go to my office. There was no point. I had already, over the previous weeks, quietly, methodically, without telling anyone, removed everything that was personally mine. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just a file here, a photograph there, a small notebook I'd kept for years where I recorded the details of client preferences that no system could capture. I moved them out one by one, over the course of about 2 weeks, in the same way I had learned to move through rooms as a busgirl, fast, silent, unnoticed. I walked out of the building instead. Into the morning air, which was cold and bright, and I stood on the sidewalk for about a minute, just breathing. And then I went home. The first few days were strange. Not painful, strange. The way silence is strange after years of noise. I woke up each morning without an alarm, which I hadn't done in over a decade. I made coffee slowly. I sat by the window and watched the city move without me, and I felt not devastated, not bitter, but oddly light. As though something heavy had been lifted off me that I hadn't fully registered I was carrying. On the 3rd day, I called no one. On the 5th day, I reviewed the non-compete clause again. Slowly. Methodically. The way I used to review vendor contracts before signing them was not looking for what it said, but for what it didn't. And that's when I found it. The clause restricted employment. It restricted me from working for, or consulting with, or acting as an agent of any competing entity in the hospitality and event space. It did not restrict ownership. It did not restrict acquisition. It did not restrict me from buying something. I sat with that for a long time. Not because it was complicated, it wasn't. It was, in fact, remarkably simple. But because the implications of it, if I followed them to their logical conclusion, were significant. And I wanted to make sure I was thinking clearly before I took a single step. I wasn't going to act out of anger. I wasn't going to act out of pride. I wasn't going to do anything that could be traced back to emotion, because emotion is sloppy, and sloppy leaves marks, and marks are what people use to build narratives about you that you can't control. I was going to act out of strategy. Clean, quiet, unhurried strategy. But not yet. First, I needed to understand the landscape. Over the next 2 weeks, I did something I hadn't done in years. I listened. Really listen, not in the way you listen during a meeting, where you're simultaneously processing and preparing your next contribution, but in the way you listen when you have nothing to prove and everything to learn. I called old contacts. Not the high-profile ones, not the CEOs and the clients and the people whose names carried weight. I called the people underneath. The coordinators. The venue managers. The vendors. The people who actually knew how things worked, Because they were the ones making them work every single day. I didn't tell them why I was calling. I didn't explain what had happened to me, or what I was thinking about doing. I simply asked questions. How are things? What's changing? What are people saying? And they told me. Because that's what happens when you spend 11 years treating people with genuine respect. When the time comes that you need information, they give it to you freely. Not because they owe you anything. Because they trust you. What I learned over those 2 weeks was this: Holloway Group was expanding aggressively. Lila's modernization plan was moving forward at a pace that was, by any reasonable standard, reckless. New properties were being acquired. Old partnerships were being restructured. The company was reaching for growth the way someone reaches for something on a high shelf, stretching too far, too fast, without checking whether the ground beneath them was solid. And one of the properties they were eyeing, one that was central to their expansion strategy, was a venue I knew intimately. The Ashford Pavilion. The same building where I had started as a busgirl. The same building where Grant had first seen me, all those years ago, moving through a crisis with calm hands and a quiet voice. It was, at that moment, independently owned. The current owner, an older man named Philip Garrett, who had bought it years ago as a semi-retirement investment, was looking to sell. Quietly. Without a public listing. The kind of sale that happens through conversations, not advertisements. I knew Philip. Not well, but enough. Enough to know that he valued discretion. Enough to know that he didn't like being rushed. And enough to know that if someone approached him with the right offer, not the highest offer, but the most thoughtful one, he would listen. I spent 3 days thinking about it. Not planning, not yet. Just thinking. Turning the idea over in my mind the way you turn a stone over in your hand, feeling its weight, its edges, its texture. And on the 4th day, I made a decision. I was going to buy the Ashford Pavilion. Not because it would hurt Holloway Group, though it would, eventually, in ways that were almost incidental to my actual purpose. Not because it would embarrass Lila, or prove Grant wrong, or vindicate anything. I was going to buy it because it was the right move. Because it was a good property, in a strong market, with real potential. Because the non-compete clause prevented me from working in hospitality, but it said nothing about owning a hospitality business. And because, if I was going to rebuild, I was going to rebuild on ground I understood better than anyone. The ground where I had started. The first call I made was to a woman named Diane Okafor. Diane was a financial consultant I had worked with years ago on a separate, personal investment, a small one, nothing significant. But the relationship had been professional, discreet, and, most importantly, trustworthy. She was the kind of person who could move money quietly, structure deals without drawing attention, and keep her mouth shut when it mattered. I called her on a Tuesday evening. "Diane," I said. "I need your help with something." "What kind of something?" "The kind that needs to stay very quiet." There was a pause. Then, "How quiet?" "The kind where no one knows my name is involved." "Not now." "Not for a while." Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear her thinking, not hesitating, exactly, but calibrating. Diane was a woman who assessed risk the way a surgeon assesses a patient before operating. Carefully. Thoroughly. Without sentiment. "Tell me more," she said. So I did. Over the next week, Diane and I built a structure. An LLC, clean, neutral, registered under a name that meant nothing to anyone. The kind of entity that could hold assets without revealing who was behind them. Diane handled the paperwork. I handled the strategy. The capital was the next piece. I had savings, not enormous, but substantial. 11 years of disciplined living and careful financial management had left me with more than most people in my position would have had. But it wasn't enough for a property acquisition on its own. I needed additional funding. And I needed it without leaving a trail that could be connected to me. I thought about investors. About venture capital. About the kind of formal, documented funding that comes with oversight and visibility and all the things I was trying to avoid. And then I thought about something else. Favors. Over 11 years at Holloway Group, I had done a great many things for a great many people. Not all of them had been thanked. Not all of them had been acknowledged. But they had been noticed quietly, in the way that people notice when someone does something for them that they didn't ask for and couldn't have done themselves. I had never called in a single favor. Not once. In 11 years. I started making calls. The thing about calling in favors is that you have to do it without it feeling like calling in favors. That was something I had learned early back in the days when I was the one receiving them, when a vendor would quietly extend a deadline for me, or a contact would pass along information they had no obligation to share. The transaction was never named. It was never acknowledged out loud. It existed in the space between people who understood each other, a quiet, unspoken economy that operated entirely on trust. So that's how I approached it. I didn't call people and say, "I need money." I didn't frame it as a loan, or an investment, or anything that required a formal agreement. I called people I had helped genuinely helped, in ways that had mattered, and I told them, simply, that I was starting something new. That I believed in it. That if they believed in me, there was a way to be part of it quietly, without their name attached, without any obligation beyond their confidence. 3 people said yes. The first was a man named Thomas Ellery, no relation to me, despite the similar name. Thomas ran a mid-sized catering company that I had, 2 years prior, quietly saved from a contractual disaster that would have cost him his largest client. I had never told him the full extent of what I'd done. I hadn't needed to. He knew. And when I called him, all I said was, "Thomas, I'm building something. I could use your support." He didn't ask how much. He asked, "When do you need it?" The second was a woman named Rita Castillo, who owned a chain of boutique hotels in the southern part of the city. Rita and I had a history that went back further than Holloway Group. She had been a colleague at a previous job, years ago, and we had stayed in quiet, intermittent contact ever since. Rita was the kind of person who made decisions quickly and trusted her instincts completely. When I explained what I was doing in broad strokes, without specifics, she simply said, "I'm in." The third took more time. But the third was the most important. Her name was Catherine Voss. Yes. That Catherine Voss. The same Catherine Voss whose gala I had coordinated for 6 consecutive years. The same Catherine Voss whose event had been reassigned to a new, inexperienced team member under Lila's direction. The same Catherine Voss who, as far as I knew, had no idea that I had left the Holloway Group. I didn't call Catherine directly. That would have been too visible, too easy to connect back to me, too easy for someone at Holloway Group to notice and question. Instead, I reached out through an intermediary. A mutual contact with a woman named Grace, who moved in the same philanthropic circles as Catherine and who owed me a quiet debt from a situation I had helped her navigate 2 years prior. I asked Grace to pass along a message. Not from me, from the LLC. From a new entity looking to acquire a property and seeking backing from someone with vision and discretion. Catherine, as it turned out, was very interested. We met once. Briefly. At a cafe neither of us frequented, on a Wednesday afternoon when the place was nearly empty. Catherine sat across from me with a cup of tea she didn't touch and looked at me with the kind of direct, unblinking attention that had made her one of the most respected philanthropists in the city. "So," she said. "The Ashford Pavilion." "Yes." "And Holloway Group doesn't know?" "No." She studied me for a long moment. Not skeptically, she was past skepticism, the way people who have spent decades reading rooms tend to be. She was simply assessing. Measuring the distance between what I was saying and what I meant. "Why?" she asked. Simply. Without inflection. I could have given her a strategic answer. A rational one. Something about market positioning and asset control and the quiet advantages of anonymity in a competitive acquisition. Instead, I told her the truth. Because I spent 11 years building something for other people, I said. And when it stopped being useful to them, they made sure I couldn't do it again. This is me doing it again. Catherine nodded. Slowly. The way someone nods when they hear something they already suspected but needed to hear out loud. How much? She asked. I told her. She didn't flinch. She didn't negotiate. She simply said, done, and picked up her tea. With the capital in place structured through Diane, distributed through the LLC, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, I made my approach to Philip Garrett. I met him at his home. A modest house on the edge of the city, with a garden that was clearly tended with more care than the interior. Philip was 72, quiet in the way that people who have spent decades in business become quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that most of what gets said is unnecessary. He offered me coffee. I accepted. We sat in his kitchen, and I laid out my offer. Not just the numbers were straightforward and fair, and Philip knew it, but the vision. What I planned to do with the property. How I planned to run it. The kind of care I intended to bring to it. Philip listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. You know this building, he said. It wasn't a question. I started there, I said. As a busgirl. A long time ago. Philip smiled. It was a small, private smile, the kind that belongs to a moment and no one else. I know, he said. I looked into you before you came here today. Not deeply. Just enough. He paused. I like that. I like that you're coming back to it. He shook my hand across the kitchen table, and the Ashford Pavilion changed hands quietly, cleanly, and without a single public record that could be traced back to Mara Ellison. The acquisition took 11 days to finalize. 11 days in which I moved through the process the way I had always moved through the world, fast, silent, purposeful. Diane handled every document. Philip handled the transfer. And I handled the thing that mattered most, the staff. Because the Ashford Pavilion had a team. Not a large one, 12 people, most of them long tenured, most of them the kind of quiet professionals who showed up, did their work, and asked for very little in return. They were, in many ways, the kind of people I had always been drawn to. The kind who understands that the best work is often the work no one sees. I met with each of them individually. Not in a group, in private, one at a time, in the small office at the back of the building that Philip had used as his own workspace for years. I told them the truth, that the property had changed hands, that I was the new owner, and that nothing about their day-to-day responsibilities was going to change. Their contracts would be honored. Their conditions would, in fact, improve slightly: better hours, better pay, better support. Every single one of them stayed. One of them, a woman named Jess, who had been a server at the pavilion for almost 4 years, looked at me after I finished and said, "You're serious? Nothing changes?" "Nothing changes," I said. She nodded. Then she said, quietly, "Good. Because this place deserves someone who gives a damn." I didn't tell her that I had once cleared tables in this very building. I didn't tell her about any of it. I simply thanked her, and she left, and I sat alone in Philip's old office for a few minutes, listening to the silence of the building around me. It felt, for the first time in months, like something was beginning. The weeks that followed were spent in careful, methodical preparation. I haven't renovated anything yet. Nothing was visible. I simply settled in. Learn the building again, the way you relearn a piece of music you played years ago, not note by note, but feeling by feeling, letting the muscle memory come back on its own. I updated the systems. Quietly. The booking protocols, the vendor relationships, the client communication standards. I brought everything into alignment with the kind of precision that I had spent 11 years practicing at Holloway Group, but this time, it was mine. Every decision was mine. Every standard was mine. And no one was going to override it. And then I waited. Because here is the thing that most people don't understand about strategy. The best kind isn't the kind that moves fast. It's the kind that moves at exactly the right speed, no faster, no slower, and waits for the other side to create the opening. I didn't have to wait long. The Holloway Group, under Lila's direction, was moving quickly. Too quickly. The expansion she had championed was consuming resources faster than the company could generate them. The new staff she had hired, younger, cheaper, less experienced, were making mistakes. Small ones at first, the kind that could be corrected quietly. But then larger ones. The kind that couldn't. I heard about them through the same network that had fed me information before. The coordinators. The vendors. The people on the ground who saw everything and reported to no one official. Catherine Voss's gala, the one that had been reassigned to the inexperienced team, had gone poorly. Not catastrophically, but noticeably. The details were wrong. The timing was off. Catherine, who had a memory like a steel trap and standards to match, had noticed every single one. She had said nothing publicly. Catherine was not the kind of person who made scenes. But she had quietly begun looking for alternatives. New venues. New coordinators. New everything. And I knew, because I had spent 6 years learning exactly how Catherine Voss operated, that when she began looking, she would eventually find me. I just had to make sure that when she did, everything was ready. So I made it ready. I spent 2 weeks preparing the pavilion for a single event, not one that had been booked, but one that I knew, with quiet certainty, was coming. I prepared it the way a surgeon prepares an operating room before the patient arrives. Everything in place. Everything is clean. Everything is perfect. And then I waited for the call. It came on a Thursday. Not from Catherine, directly from Grace, the intermediary, who called me at 7 in the morning and said, simply, she wants to move her gala. She wants to know if the pavilion can host it. I didn't hesitate. Tell her yes, I said. Tell her we'll call her by the end of the day with every detail. I hung up, and I sat for a moment in the quiet of the pavilion's small back office, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not excitement. Not triumph. Something closer to alignment. The feeling of a piece falling into exactly the place it was always meant to occupy. The event was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Lila Holloway, I knew, had already confirmed Catherine Voss's gala as part of Holloway Group's calendar. It was listed publicly, on their website, as one of their signature events for the season. Which meant that when Catherine quietly redirected it to the pavilion, to my pavilion, the change would be noticed. Not by me. By them. And I needed to be ready for what happened next. The night of Catherine Voss's gala, I wore black. Not the kind of black that demands attention, a simple dress, well cut, unremarkable. The kind of outfit that says nothing about the person wearing it, which was exactly the point. I had spent months becoming invisible again, deliberately, strategically invisible, and I wasn't about to undo that now. Not before the moment arrived. I arrived at the pavilion 2 hours early. The staff were already there, Jess and the rest of them, moving through the space with the kind of quiet efficiency that only comes from people who genuinely care about the work they're doing. The flowers were arranged. The lighting was set. The tables were dressed with a precision that would have taken most teams twice as long to achieve. I walked through the space slowly, checking everything. Not because I didn't trust my team completely, but because this was my ritual. The same ritual I had performed hundreds of times before, at Holloway Group, at events I would never be publicly thanked for. The walk-through. The small adjustments. The final, silent confirmation that everything was exactly where it needed to be. It was. I stepped into the back office, poured myself a glass of water, and waited. Catherine arrived at 7. She walked into the pavilion and stopped just for a second, barely noticeable, and something crossed her face that I recognized. It was the look of someone who had been disappointed recently, and was surprised to find themselves not disappointed now. She turned to me, and for the first time since I had known her, she smiled without reserve. "Mara," she said. "This is beautiful." "Thank you, Catherine." She studied me for a moment the way she always did, with that direct, measuring gaze, and then she said, quietly, "I'm glad you're back." I didn't tell her I had never really left. I simply nodded, and she moved into the room, and the evening began. The guests arrived in a steady, unhurried stream, the kind of crowd that Catherine's events always drew. Philanthropists, businesspeople, a handful of quiet money that never made headlines but moved the world in ways that headlines never could. They moved through the space with ease, drawn in by the warmth of it, the calm, the feeling of being somewhere that had been prepared with genuine care. It was 40 minutes into the evening when Lila Holloway walked in. I saw her before she saw me. She was standing near the entrance, a glass of champagne already in her hand, though I hadn't seen her take it, scanning the room with the particular expression of someone who had just realized they were in the wrong place. Or rather, the right place, but under the wrong circumstances. Because Lila had come expecting to oversee this event. It was on Holloway Group's calendar. It was supposed to be one of their flagship moments of the season, the kind of event that justified the expansion, the restructuring, all the changes she had championed. She had come to be seen. To be in charge. And instead, she was standing in a building she had no authority over, at an event run by someone she had helped push out of the industry. I watched her process this. It happened in stages, the confusion first, then the calculation, then something harder to name. Something that lived in the space between embarrassment and anger. She didn't leave. I hadn't expected her to. Lila was not, for all her flaws, a coward. She was simply someone who had never been in a room where the power didn't belong to her. And she didn't know, yet, how to move in one. I gave her time. I stayed where I was behind the bar, near the back, where I had positioned myself for the evening. Not hiding. Simply present. Quietly, calmly, undeniably present. It was Jess who came to me first, about 20 minutes after Lila arrived. "There's a woman near the entrance," Jess said, keeping her voice low. "She's asking to speak to whoever's running the event." "I know who she is," I said. Jess looked at me, a long, steady look, the kind that says more than words. She had worked in hospitality long enough to read a room. She knew something was happening here that was bigger than a single event. "How do you want me to handle it?" she asked. "Send her back here," I said. Politely. Jess nodded and disappeared. Lila arrived at the back of the room 2 minutes later. She was composed on the surface, at least. The champagne glass was still in her hand, though it was nearly empty now. Her eyes moved around the space quickly, taking in the details, before they settled on me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "This event is supposed to be at our venue." "It was," I said. "Catherine made a different choice." "Catherine doesn't." Lila stopped. Recalibrated. Started again. "My father's company has a contract with Catherine Voss. This event is part of that agreement." I looked at her steadily. Not coldly, I want to be clear about that. There was no malice in the way I held her gaze. There was simply nothing. No performance. No tension. No theater. Just two people in a room, and one of them knowing something the other didn't yet fully grasp. "You should check that contract," I said. Carefully. Something shifted in Lila's expression. A flicker, small, fast, gone before it could fully form. But I saw it. "What do you mean?" she asked. Catherine's agreement with Holloway Group included a clause that allowed her to redirect events to approved alternative venues if certain service standards weren't met. That clause was triggered 3 weeks ago, after the preliminary coordination for this event fell below her requirements. I paused. Let that settle. The Ashford Pavilion is an approved alternative venue. Has been for years. I simply made sure it was available. Lila stared at me. The champagne glass was very still in her hand now. You planned this, she said. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I simply picked up the glass I had been polishing, the same glass, the one from the beginning of this story, the one I had been holding when she first walked in, and set it down on the bar with a quiet, precise click. Lila, I said. This is Catherine's evening. And it's going beautifully. I'd suggest you enjoy it. She left without another word. Back into the crowd, back into the warmth and the light, where no one had noticed the exchange and no one needed to. That was the point. This was never meant to be a scene. It was never meant to be loud, or public, or dramatic. It was simply a consequence. A quiet, inevitable consequence, delivered without raised voices or harsh words, in a room full of people who would never know it had happened. I watched her go. And I felt nothing. Not satisfied. Not vindication. Not the particular warmth that people imagine you feel when something like this plays out the way you planned. What I felt was clarity. The same clarity I had felt on that couch, in the dark, months ago when the door had closed and the sediment had settled and I had understood, finally, exactly where I stood. The evening continued. Catherine Voss moved through the room with the ease of someone who knew her event was exactly where it was supposed to be. The guests stayed late. The conversation was warm, unhurried, and genuine. Jess and the team moved through the space like water, invisible, necessary, perfect. And I stayed where I was. Behind the bar. Watching. Grant Holloway did not come that night. I had not expected him to. But I heard, in the days that followed through the same quiet network that had carried information to me all along, that he had seen the coverage. The event had been written about in 2 industry publications. Small pieces, both of them. Respectful. The kind of coverage that doesn't shout but is noticed by exactly the right people. Holloway Group's expansion plans were quietly restructured in the weeks that followed. I don't know the details of those conversations. I wasn't in the room, and I didn't need to be. What I know is that the pace slowed. The recklessness retreated. And Lila's role, while it didn't disappear entirely, became smaller. Quieter. Less central than it had been. I didn't hear from Grant. Not directly. Not a call, not a message, not a single word passed through an intermediary. And I didn't reach out to him either. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said, not in words, but in actions. In the quiet, steady, unhurried way that actions speak when words have been used up. Catherine Voss became a regular at the pavilion. So did others, quietly, one by one, drawn in by the same thing that had drawn her. Not glamour. Not a spectacle. Just the feeling of being somewhere that was run with care. With attention. With the kind of invisible precision that most people never notice until it's gone. The pavilion grew. Slowly. Steadily. The way things grow when they're not being rushed. And I grew with it. I didn't tell anyone the full story of how I got here. Not Jess, not Diane, not even Catherine. Some stories don't need to be told to be understood. They exist in the space between what happened and what people see now, in the gap between the busgirl who cleared tables in this building 20 years ago and the woman who owns it today. I think about that sometimes. About the distance between those 2 versions of myself. About how the path between them wasn't a straight line, or a dramatic arc, or any of the shapes that stories are supposed to take. It was quieter than that. More irregular. More human. I didn't win anything back. Not really. Not in the way that word usually means. What I did was something smaller. Something that, to me, feels larger. I stopped losing. And on nights like this, when the pavilion is empty and the chairs are still and the building hums with the kind of silence that only old spaces hold, I pour myself a glass of water, and I sit in the small back office where Philip Garrett once sat, and I listen. Not for anything in particular. Just for the sound of a place that is exactly where it's supposed to be. And so am I. If this story moved something inside you, if you've ever been the person who worked in the shadows, who gave quietly, and was still somehow made to feel like it wasn't enough, just know, you are not alone in that. And your worth was never determined by the people who failed to see it. Remember this, the quietest victories are often the deepest ones. If you have a story like this, a moment where you were underestimated and found your own way back, I'd love to hear it in the comments. This is that kind of space. Thank you, genuinely, for staying until the end. That means more than you know. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need it today. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because there are more stories like this one coming, each one carrying its own quiet lesson. Until next time, take care of yourself. You matter more than you realize.